Hey everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip has to do with the mid-year changes that the Georgia Association of Realtors released for their contract package. So as you know, the GAR, or Georgia Association of Realtors, for their contract packages, they revise them every January of every year, and then they do a mid-year revision that comes out in May or June. Well, the mid-year revision for the 2020 contracts was just released May 1st, 2020. So I want to discuss those changes with you. Not a whole lot of changes, but I do want to inform you what those are so that you are aware of them as you write contracts moving forward. So the first biggest change has to do with the changes they made on the sale or lease contingency exhibit. And that is the sale or lease contingency exhibit is exhibit 601. And what that entails is if there is a buyer who was going to purchase a seller's home, but they have the home they have to sell first, they make the contract contingent upon them being able to sell their current home before going through with the purchase of the new home. Now, what the options available in that exhibit is for the seller to just accept it and go under contract with this buyer, and the seller just waits until they sell their home. Or there is a kick-out option for the seller, and what that means, we refer to it as the kick-out clause, and what that means is the seller says, yes, I'll go ahead and go under contract with you, understanding that you need to sell your current home first, but you have to allow me to continue to market my home for sale. And if I get another buyer that I want to negotiate and work with buyer number 2, I'm going to come back to you because I'm under contract with you and ask you to either, are you able to go through the deal with me? And if so, there are certain contingencies that I'm going to ask you to remove. If you're not able to remove those contingencies, then you are going to terminate the contract and get your earnest money back. So we're all familiar with what the terms of the kick-out clause are. But for the changes, for the May 1st changes, 2020 for GAR, is they've reformatted that whole form, and it's much easier to understand. They haven't changed any of the options. They haven't changed the kick-out clause. And in January of this year, they did separate it out. It used to be you removed, the buyer number 1 would remove all contingencies in favor of the buyer. In January of this year, they separated it out so the buyer could either remove, the buyer and seller, they negotiate to either remove all contingencies or could itemize and pick and choose what contingencies they removed if the seller exercised the kick out and the buyer wanted to stay in contract. So they haven't changed that, but they have changed the formatting and the verbiage to make it much easier to understand. So you will see it is a 2-page document now, and in paragraph D, they actually fully explain what the kick out means, which is what I just went over. And then it goes on, and the kick-out clause, the specific kick-out clause per this transaction, it itemizes either all contingencies are removed if the seller does exercise the kick-out clause for buyer number 1, and buyer number 1 does want to stay in contract with the seller. You can either negotiate to remove all contingencies, or again, there is that checklist, the sale or lease, just the sale of their property, just due diligence, the right to request repairs, or a variety of those as they get negotiated. So again, it is a little bit easier to understand, and it specifically explains. There was a question when the January form came out as to if those boxes were checked, were they still part of the contract, or did those items get removed? So that is further clarified in this version, and it specifically states that the contingencies and or due diligence period checked below shall no longer be part of this agreement. meaning if those are checked, seller exercises the kickout, buyer stays in the contract, it would no longer be subject to whatever those items were that were checked when the parties were negotiating. So again, I think you will find that the language is much easier to understand to clarify the intent of the party. So that form has been completely reformatted. The next form that GAR changed in May 1st is the all cash or no financing contingency exhibit, and that is form F401. And this is how agents were using this form anyway, but they specifically put in the verbiage that the buyer reserves the right to pay for all or portion of this contract with a hard money loan. And again, I think in practice, a lot of agents were using that all cash exhibit to make the contract if the buyer was getting a hard money loan, but they just specifically spelled out that verbiage. So you will see that again in that all cash, no financing contingency exhibit, and that is under paragraph 1A. The next form that they changed, thank you, GAR, we appreciate this so very much, is the form GAR F510, the exhibit for the closing attorney to be the holder of the earnest money. This form has drastically undergone many changes, a variety of changes since its inception. One of the changes that they made was previous to May, is that the form of the earnest money, if the closing attorney was going to be identified as the holder, could only be in the form of a wire or ACH. And we already have discussed that the closing attorneys here in Metro Atlanta will not accept ACH funds into their IOLTA or trust accounts. So the form said that it had to be in the form of a wire. It also went on to say that the closing attorney could not alter the form. However, in practice, we were having all kinds of closing attorneys accepting the earnest money in a form other than a wire. And that necessitated the agents to have to do an amendment because now the parties are no longer, there's a breach to the contract because of the closing attorney's actions. Again, this has all been discussed in previous videos. So thank you, GAR. I think as a broker, this is one of my favorite changes. In the exhibit, closing attorney acting as holder of earnest money, under the paragraph where it talks about the form of the earnest money, paragraph 5, it does state earnest money must be paid to the closing attorney acting as holder by wire transfer. So that part is still in bold, and that's the title of that paragraph. However, it goes on to say, buyers shall be responsible for paying all earnest money and other buyer trust funds to the closing attorney acting as holder by wire transfer of immediately available funds, so they did take out the ACH, or by such other method deemed acceptable and or required by the closing attorney as the case may be. So in essence, they made it so that the closing attorney can accept any form of the earnest money, any form for the earnest money funds, and it does not have to strictly be a wire. So again, that just, they took out ACH, and that eliminates the need for an amendment should the closing attorney accept other forms. The other big change that they made, and this really isn't a big change, this is a change that is that they had to make because it's required by the EPA, is on the lead-based paint exhibit. And also I've done previous videos on the lead-based paint exhibit. The EPA requires that this form be signed and completed by a seller prior to a buyer going under contract with the seller. The problem was that was not always happening in practice. So in order to help agents and buyers and sellers remember that this is an EPA requirement, on the GAR lead-based paint exhibit, which is form F316, it does state in all caps and bold at the very beginning, under federal law, this exhibit must be signed by this form is also to be used in a lease transaction. So it says, under federal law, this exhibit must be signed by the seller/landlord and buyer/tenant and the buyer-tenant provided with a copy of the lead-based paint brochure prior to the buyer/tenant and seller landlord entering into a binding agreement. This agreement must be filled out for all housing built prior to 1978. So again, GAR just put in verbiage in there to be in compliance with the EPA, that this document must be signed by buyer and seller or landlord-tenant in the case of a lease before the contract becomes binding. Now, it also references the lead-based paint brochure, and you as an agent, you may find this brochure in the GAR contract package, and that would be brochure CB04 in the GAR contract package, or you can find it online at the EPA's website. Point of practice for you listing agents: if the property is built prior to 1978, go ahead and have that seller complete that form and sign it, and then upload it into the MLS services where you have all your other documents that a buyer may review and a selling agent may download to include as part of the contract. So what do you think? You like the changes? Not that many, right? Any other changes that you think GAR needs to correct or change or make on the contracts, perhaps for 2021? Comment below what you think some of those changes should be, anything that you have seen in practice, and we'll get that information to GAR and see what they do. Just a side note, there are some other changes that the Georgia Association of Realtors did make in their contract package form as of May 1st, 2020. Those are mostly some typographical changes, some semantics changes, and paragraph number changes. But I will link the index to those changes below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. See my pups. Hey girls.